impacting on policy change through the question of through the mode of framing the issue. And I'm curious the extent to which you see religion and religious orientation as a valuable framing reference, particularly given the papal initiative, which has really I think, transformed at least the formal doctrine of the Church with respect to nuclear weapons. On the other hand, although I realize you don't have a sample here, there's a big debate now being waged within the Russian Orthodox Church about whether or not Russian nuclear weapons should be consecrated by Orthodox priests. And there are various studies looking at that issue. So, I mean, those are two different ways in which, the framing of the issue religiously might make a difference, and particularly the impact of Pope Francis. I would be kind of curious to know, given that he actually ventured forth at the December 2014 conference, International Conference on the Humanitarian Consequences of Nuclear Weapons. So perhaps that has resonated or not resonated in some fashion to audiences that have been exposed. The suggestion here, and this is a sincere suggestion, is that while your audience, while your respondents, presumably are kind of lay persons, given the forthcoming 2020 NPT Review Conference, the 25th anniversary of the indefinite extension, the 50th anniversary of the conference, the 75th anniversary of the bombings, I think it would be really intriguing to undertake a similar survey of those delegates present, accredited delegates at the review conference. I'm not sure how much faith I would place in their honesty in responding, but nonetheless it would be quite interesting. I think that could be done relatively easily. If you're interested, let's talk offline about doing that, because it would be a very interesting kind of new sample against which to compare your more general results.
That sounds like a great idea. Well, this let's talk about this. Yeah, that sounds like a great idea. When it comes to religious framing, in my view, or if our instinct about how moral framing works is correct, it could have an interesting effect. Religion is generally a factor that is, for many people is like a guidance, like a roadmap, for morality. They are even if they have some of their instincts, this is kind of helping them to guide their way in very specific issues that they are encountering in everyday life. So so getting this, from an authority, which is a religious one, actually might alter the attitudes, and they might basically have to be able to shape their ideas of some policies in a way that that the authority would be proposing. So that's something that we didn't do it, so I cannot. It would be dishonest for me to say that it works because I don't know, but my instinct would be that this is something that's definitely worth trying, and that this sounds like something very potentially intriguing area for generally NGOs, which in my view, I'm quite critical of work of a lot of these NGOs, in which I believe they do amazing, they have amazing project, they have amazing idea, which I support wholeheartedly, but very often they'll actually fail to convince the people they need to convince. So this might be a way how to work it out.
If I kind of just follow up, if you were going to do this in the NPT context, the other thing that would be quite interesting from a research standpoint is the controversy having to do with whether or not states parties will or should address the question of the viability of the Reagan-Gorbachev principle that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. And that is likely to be one of the issues that is debated at the review conference, which would seem to be relevant also to the question that you're asking.
Mm-hmm. All right. Yeah, I will get in touch with you, and let's work out something. I think that will be super interesting. And it's quite a solid sample of people to work with. So scientific languages.
Number of comments, and I'm curious to hear your reaction. One is just a little scholarly footnotes. I don't know to what extent you know, but there was one intriguing philosophers in the 30s of the 20th century. He was Norwegian philosopher Erne Næss, Naess, quite well known. And he looked at the idea of truth through various kind of psychological studies of what people think about you. Obviously, he was talking about many philosophers by leaving the normative and going to, but it's interesting that he was one of the first people to look into what people think about it. In our time, my colleague and friend Maria Rose-Burley which you probably know, she has also used social psychology to look at normative issues. So just
she actually the special issue that I mentioned on nuclear taboo, she also wrote a paper for it. So.
Okay. Now, my question or my issue with that is, and I had this also with Scott, is the questions of the really relevance and relevance for what purpose. I think somewhat sociologically, it's interesting what people think about it and the distribution, and it just shows how much nuclear education is important because it shows how much the ignorance is widespread. But the real question is not so much what lay people think about it, because it's not that much relevant to decision making, to use, to all that. I always felt that there was no study, and it would be complicated to do it, and it's not social psychology, but it's more one-on-one interview. What true policymakers, especially heads of state, former heads of state, who had control of nuclear weapons, who were in possession, especially of the 8 or 9 countries that has nuclear weapons, how they thought about the use of nuclear weapons, what it's for them, how they view it. There was never study of that nature was made. It will be difficult. Some people will be reluctant to cooperate. But even in a larger scale, I mean, one is what Bill raised, but for example, you think about all the people who are involved at the chain of command, involving with executing and advising and, the presidential use of nuclear weapons, from the people in the silos to the people, the generals, the head of the strategic command, what they think about it. I mean, the people who are knowledgeable to some extent. I think it would be very interesting to try to reach. One is the population that Bill was talking about, but I'm also talking about different kind of populations, because these are the people who are involved with that. You assume that they have the knowledge, and in terms of thinking about their views are much more significant than just the lay people in the street. So I wonder about that kind of thing, because the significance beyond the sociology for policy making, for how to think about nuclear weapons, it's less relevant from the lay people to the elites.
I absolutely agree with that, and this is like one of the most common criticism of Scott's work, I would say, because many people are basically saying, it's great that you did this study, but what really doesn't tell us about, how nuclear weapons could be used in the real world when, 99.9% of these people would never had a shot at deciding anything close to nuclear policies. This is a very common criticism. I think it's a fair criticism in many aspects, especially for people who actually want to find out answer to these questions. And I see from two perspectives. First, in my case, I'm lately more and more interested in not necessarily how states are deciding, but a little bit more about how generally individuals, people think about these issues and what are the psychological mechanisms of how they are deciding. So for me, this would be not really about if it's 50 or 60% people, but really finding out what are the psychological differences between individual people. That's more of my interest than generally for political science, which is a little bit more interesting, bigger picture question. Another thing that I find interesting, which is very important, and something that I and Carmen Wunderlich have been writing in a new paper that we just wrote, is that these studies, in my view, are important in finding out actually the differences between how elites and how general population thinks, because this could actually reveal us about the effect of norms. Because, for example, Scott in his paper is claiming something which I have some trouble with. He's basically saying, okay, so if we take our sample and we look at some elite characteristics, for example, education and income, etc., we can say that, okay, so these are the elites, and these elites are then becoming the presidents, and they are becoming members of parliament, etc. So they are deciding over the course of issues. And I think it's not completely true, because in my view, what happens is that once these people are getting to these positions of power, they are becoming socialized with international norms, which are shaping their thinking much more than some of their just elite status or income or education, but just because they are finally finding themselves talking to very different people, getting very different ideas about how things should work, and they are completely changing their mind. Many people who work at the State Department will confirm you that after a few years spending there, they suddenly either see things differently, or at least understand better why other people see things differently, because they are in a totally different social environment. So if we would be able to better integrate the studies from the first wave, which are just about elites, and the second wave, which are more about general public, we can see how much effects actually these norms and socialization makes about how people are deciding. That's a very rough idea, which is very far from what we are doing still. Definitely not claiming we are anywhere near to deciding this question, but it's more my argument why these both streams are very important, and combining them to find out about these differences. And what you say about finding out about elites, yes, that would be absolutely the best. I think with individual policymakers, the biggest trouble is that it's very hard to find out if what they are telling you is actually in any way true or not.
I would just also add the methodology is quite different. As opposed to giving a questionnaire, I'm thinking about one-on-one discussion that you discuss with, especially if you are aiming at key individuals, people in position of power, how they came into having these kind of beliefs, how it was evolving in their own mind, what does it mean, the responsibility of possessing that kind of decisions, how it changed them. I mean, that kind of in-depth interview, and try to have a sense.
I think it should absolutely take place, this kind of research. Generally, the problem that we encounter, but with every research you have a lot of problems, about how to interpret results. The biggest problem with this one is that if the person is still in the office, you have a problem that the person cannot say what they want.
Is very different.
And once they leave the office, they are still, caring about their image, right? There are a lot of people who will, be writing memoirs or giving interviews afterwards, and they, they can now say things that couldn't say before when they were in the office, but they are still caring about what people think about them as people, as persons, So they want to, leave some legacy, and then maybe some, present themselves to be, better, or I don't know, in a way they believe that they would be better impact. So it's very so I think it's important. It can help us a lot, but it will be very hard to say that what they are saying or they are claiming in the in-depth interview is actually how they would be thinking in that situation in real life. They would be maybe picturing it, and very often that's also based on findings of psychology. Very often people try to, after some time, rationalize many things or feelings they had at some point, and give it some new framing and explain it even for themselves. It's not necessarily that people will be lying. It's very often people are also lying to themselves because they want to live with themselves and believing that they're actually good people and they would be doing good things. So they are trying to rationalize many of their feelings they had at the point. So it's important. It makes a lot of sense. It's just very difficult to say, okay, this is how they would actually think in that situation. So unless, and of course, but of course you will always encounter some problems like this. One more point about the military. This is what we want to do is something like a middle way, and this is what we are trying to do possibly this year, is to cooperate some of the war colleges here and with people who are educating military officers or mid-range military officers studying, which already are some kind of elites. There are military elites that already are socialized in a way, some military ethics and some ideas about how weapons should be used, and try to see what they think about these issues. The advantage is that you can get a little bit larger samples than just a few individuals in power, and still you have people that is definitely not general population, but people that are somewhat elite. So this is something we would like to try. Again, there are still a lot of challenges that we would do, and I'm usually when we are presenting all these findings, it's very important to say not to take them really completely literal. I would say it's more like a direction of that can help us to enlighten a little bit more, but it's far from some definitive results or anything. But yeah, this survey of military elites can definitely tell us a little bit more about what they think.
I might take the right to two-finger on this conversation for a second, and we can go back to questions. But just kind of two quick points. There are little bits and pieces of what you have requested, Avner, and one very interesting and intriguing piece of work is there was some research done by a young Israeli scholar who then left our field again to go into the world of alternative energy named Moriel Lotan, who had worked with Dima Adamski at IDC, but she had an article in the journal, I think Comparative Strategy, and then she co-authored a piece with Janice Stein for my edited volume on behavioral economics and nuclear weapons. But what she and Janice showed is that there's some significant anecdotal evidence that nuclear operators in the chain of command were so fearful of nuclear war that there are documented cases of them essentially completely violating orders and standard operating procedures and refusing to pass warnings of possible nuclear attack up the chain or to pass orders back down the chain to increase alert levels when they thought it might be a false alarm.
That's the story of Petrov.
So Petrov is the famous story, correct, but there are other examples besides Petrov. He's the most famous. So that suggests one way in which...
And it's in general about specific country?
Mostly US plus Petrov. Those are the examples we know. Hard to find evidence on other countries. But that would suggest that a sample of nuclear operators would be different than the general population sample. I'm going to take the right to be inappropriately snarky for 1 second, too. But your comment about how once people get into government, they get socialized has reminded me of what appears to be one very famous recent exception to that. If you've seen the story from the new book by two Washington Post reporters, A Very Stable Genius. Apparently, Jim Mattis and Rex Tillerson tried to bring President Trump to the tank at the Pentagon to give him the socialization briefing about how the world works, and reportedly it didn't go well. He was immune to socialization.
Well, everyone who's doing statistics knows that there are deviant cases. So.
Yes. We have other questions, especially any of the students there? Or Fabian?
Thank you so much. My name is Fabian Hitz. I'm a research associate here. I have a comment and a question regarding the mystery about chemical weapons use. One thing it reminded me of is like death sentences and ways of execution 100 years ago, when some people would be beheaded or have a firing squad and others would be hanged, and it made a lot of difference because one was honorable and the other one wasn't. And I wonder whether there could be a similar effect, because we have grown so accustomed to the fact that nuclear deterrence, the use of nuclear weapons, is something respectable states do, that superpowers do. But chemical weapons is something that like terrorists or loony developing country dictators do. So whether like the use of them would be a sort of act of your own identity as well. That's one thing I ask myself. The other thing is regarding the acceptance of these the use of chemical and nuclear weapons. So I studied the Middle East a lot, and from my intuitive feeling, there's one major variable deciding whether the use of a weapon is appropriate or not, and that is who uses it against who. So I really wonder whether you have tried to adjust that and have like different case scenarios where the identity of the government using the nuclear weapon changes, or the identity of the target changes, and how it influences the gun kills.
Excellent. As for the first comment, I absolutely agree, and it's a comment that I got at Brown University from a student, and when he told me, it absolutely makes a lot of sense to me. This is the way how these weapons are very often, like socially discursively constructed, in world politics, and I think it could definitely make a difference. I absolutely agree with that, and I already have a comment that we should somehow incorporate this idea to the study. So completely agree. And against whom and who? Yeah, there's one very interesting thing which is kind of obvious, but I never thought about it before, because when Nina Tanavold, she sent me this paper for the special issue that I mentioned. The title of her paper, I hope I can say it out loud, but that was a comment on surveys about the use of nuclear weapons against Muslims. And I was like, okay, what she's talking about? And then I realized, okay, like all everything that Scott has been doing. Okay, later he also had a new study on North Korea, so then it's not correct anymore. But before was actually the use of nuclear weapons against Muslims, and I'm not really sure if it's relevant or not, or if we should talk about it. But it was, but basically she also mentioned or claimed, and some people kind of agree with that it's a very specific use against against some people, and it might be very different if we would actually use an example of something very different or some very different target. And from the other side, what I also found maybe to be even more interesting is to that maybe it's not, if we want to really find out about the morality and taboo, maybe instead of evaluating the policies of the United States, which is your own country, which is using weapons, and you have so many like this confounding variables, like, okay, it's my own country, do I believe my government, do I, should I stand behind my troops and everything, shouldn't we like actually take it from the other side and ask people from other countries what they think about it, if people in France, UK, Czech Republic, Slovakia, how they would feel about United States using nuclear weapons / chemical weapons and conventional weapons when they would see it as an ally using it. So of course there's again some kind of alignment to the country, but it's not they don't have this necessarily all these like extra factors about their own government deciding. So so against whom and who would be doing it? That's a very important question. I think there will be like many of these external studies in the future made in this direction, and at some point it would be very good if someone would make like a meta study of all this and try to make sense of all this, how it works, and try to give us a little bit clearer picture about what it says.
Sam?
Hi, my name is Sam Meyer. I'm a researcher here at CNS. It's really fascinating. First of all, as an American veteran who supports nuclear disarmament, I really wish your notional organization
Go start it, Sam.
You should. I'm proud of how convincing we are. That's great. But so first, a quick comment about sort of the direction of your research that you referred to at the end there. For a vaguely related project, I recently kind of surveyed some of the public discussion and debate around the neutron bomb and enhanced radiation weapons in the 70s. And that was kind of instructive on this discrepancy between the nuclear taboo and the chemical taboo and how they interact. It frequently happened that that opponents of the neutron bomb would specifically point to how similar these were to chemical weapons as a reason why they were so particularly abhorrent and why they shouldn't be incorporated into the arsenal. So I thought that was kind of something that might be an avenue for research. Question is I had on your findings is how would you say they interact with this modern phenomenon of the increasing, not only kind of sociological, but psychological sorting of individuals into different political camps? There's a lot of research about how, as opposed to the more kind of heterogeneous political parties that we used to have, especially that we had like during the Cold War in the United States. Frankly, Democrats think like other Democrats, and Republicans think like other Republicans in the U.S. context. But this is also, I think this also occurs in other democracies and even in non-democracies around the world. It seems like there might be some unique threat there. There might even be some unique opportunity there. But yeah, what have you thought about that?
There is actually like in psychology, there's a lot of discussion because Jonathan Haidt and other colleagues, when they were trying to make sense of their research in the context of political issues, they have like a very convincing research supported by strong evidence about how liberals and conservatives think differently, and how that and this is actually one of the title of these TED Talks. It's about conservative basically relying on different moral foundations than liberals. But there's a lot of discussion like last couple of years about which way actually the causality works, and this is like very much unclear because we actually don't know what it means. If it means that if you are born a certain way, then brought up a certain way, and this actually make you to be a conservative person. Or if you kind of during life join one of these political camps, and then you adjust your morality, and you adjust the way how you approach this issue so that it fits with other people around you in this camp. And frankly, we actually don't know. I mean, Jonathan Haidt and others, they like automatically presuppose, okay, so we have this idea, okay, so we have like a very long evolution. People have some moral foundation, then they are born, they have these drafts. These drafts are somehow adjusted when people are raised up, and then they have certain beliefs, and then of course they are voting in a way and approach issues in a certain way and have different attitudes, and this is what makes them liberal and conservative. But maybe it works like completely other way around, and maybe like morality of people or how they approach issues is much more flexible and elastic, and once you've basically found yourself to be in a certain group, in-group of people with different beliefs and ideas about ethics and morality, you can be much more flexible about adjusting it. I was even thinking about myself, about my life and how I was approaching issues when I was 17, 18, what kind of people I was hanging out with, and I realized, maybe actually like things that I found to be like moral when I was 18, maybe I approached them very differently, and that and what actually caused it. So this is in a way also like a critique of people that always that try to be like too scientific about so we say about how they work, and they think they can measure everything, but we actually don't know. We don't even know which way these arrows actually exactly goes, which way the causality, and I think this is still a very, very we still have a very long way to find out about how these mechanisms actually work.
More questions, Carlton?
All right, so I have two.
Introduce yourself.
So my name is Carlton Doro, and you describe pop culture as being fascinated with the last moment, going out with a bang, so that nuclear weapons are found to be more attractive, while chemical weapons use is found to be horrifically dishonorable. So my question is, did the moral foundations affect the sense of responsibility for both the binding and individualization moral frameworks between conservatives and liberal groups, and to what extent do you see this attitude going in the future?
I'm not sure if I know what you mean. Can you?
Essentially, what I'm asking is, for the sense of responsibility between the two groups, where do you see this going? Like, is it what you expected to find?
Between liberals and conservatives? I would say it was kind of what we expected. Basically the reason is, or the reasoning behind is that let's say it's not necessarily that conservative people, or it's definitely not that conservative people don't care about well-being of others, or that they are completely that's complete nonsense. That they wouldn't care that some people would be dying in a horrific way. That's not really the reasoning. The reasoning is that, let's say, conservative people, and conservative is a big, very generalized group of people that are like on these bonding foundations, are taking more of these moral concerns into account than liberals. So, for example, for liberals, it would be like very straight out. And I'm really super simplifying this. It really doesn't apply to everyone. It's like a very aggregate numbers. But for liberals, it would be like much more instinctively, reaction based on suffering of certain individuals, and they would like be much more quickly to oppose it. But for conservatives, when they would be like having these moral instincts, they would take account, for example, okay, but we care much more, for example, about our group, and if this threat is annihilated, it's like lowering the potential threat to some people in our group, and we actually care much more about our in-group than about the out-group. Mm-hmm. So then they are kind of weighing this, and then they are much more, let's say, open to the idea that a higher number of people of out-group would die in order to lower the chance that some harm will be done to our own in-group, based on loyalty to your in-group, etc. So this is a very important concern, and there's a lot of discussion, and it's actually like defense of some, let's say, conservative thinking in international relations, or about the use of force. That just the fact that some people very often people make this very simple dichotomy that you have these liberal ideas about protecting people everywhere, and this is a good thing, and other people are this just Machiavellistic people who are just taking care of their interests. But many of these people are actually have it's based on very very moral instincts that are in depth, very moral. That they believe it's moral to protect your people more than others, and in this case, they would be preferring the policies that would be lowering the threat to your own people. So it's also morality. It's just like a different morality than many people understand. Maybe for many people this wouldn't be a moral decision at all, but when we see the emotional reactions of these people, it makes sense to frame it this way. Yeah.
And for my second question, so this is regarding a neutron bomb against the advancing Soviet tanks, as you mentioned before. And my question is, could perceptions in this case have something to do with the Soviet proposed idea that capitalist governments, they care only about the money versus killing people? So
we covered the neutron bomb in the intro class this morning, and I told them about the old propaganda that the neutron bomb was the capitalist bomb because it killed people but preserved property.
Okay, I think for propaganda purposes it's a clever framing, and at the time it makes sense. It makes a coherent message. I mean, in a way it makes sense. It would be interesting to find out more. I recently read some stuff. Actually, I really found fascinating your comment about I never knew about this link or this discursive move about comparing with chemical weapons. I never heard about it, and I found it super interesting actually. And yeah, I mean, sure. I take it more like a propaganda framing, but obviously we probably have no data about to see how effective this framing was in the Soviet Union at the time, and what people saw. And if anyone would have data from that period, I don't think we could really rely on this data as something that would be close to truth.
Having lived through that period as an anti-nuclear activist, I can tell you anecdotally it seemed like it worked, but that's anecdote, not hard data. I have a quick question for you. I'm just curious if you've briefed your findings about framing to the folks at ICANN, and if you spoke to them, how did they react?
We didn't speak to them at all. So far I never presented this to anyone from ICANN.
You should.
I should. Yeah, I should. I'm sure they wouldn't like it. I'm pretty sure. Yeah. I mean, in case of ICANN. Yeah, I have a lot of doubts about their let's say strategy being really effective in some longer term. I think they, of course, in a policy world and they achieved for NGO they achieved remarkable things in a way. They are extremely successful in many aspects when it comes to how we usually see NGOs to work, right? I mean, many NGOs would like to have this kind of influence in general debate as they do. But I have a lot of doubts about if their framing of issues, their strategies are really the ones that are really achieving, let's say, some broader support for these policies, or in many aspects I even see their policies to be very counterproductive in many aspects. I also discussed this with some people from let's say ministries, from policy sphere, with diplomats in our part of the world, and I can see that, for example, the discourse of ICANN or the way they are promoting the issues, and again, this, let's say, my view of things based on some interviews with diplomats, is that it eventually, in many aspects, it made things worse. I mean, this way of stigmatizing all people that are not exactly in their camp, but that used to consider themselves some years ago to be somehow bridge builders and looking for some balance. Many of these people are actually becoming much more conservative and actually much more much less supportive of some compromise and becoming much against, let's say, disarmament ideas. There was an effect that, for example, a lot of in our countries, a lot of funding for disarmament projects have been actually stopped also in consequence of this, because they just they just saw that suddenly that supporting this armament is is backfiring to them, that they are supporting ideas that eventually then they have presentations at the peer review conference and they are being stigmatized as weasels who are just who are just trying to find some wiggle room for them, and they are not interested genuinely in some good progress. And so there might be some counterproductive effects, and I think it would be very good to consider these issues, and maybe some of this framing in your research would be useful to see if maybe some of the framing advocating strategies might be adjusted in order to achieve in the bigger picture some more success. I don't know.
If there's interest, if we take one or two more questions, and just have anything you wanted to ask, Shravan, where we had a second question, we can come back to you.
Well, I mean, actually, I think I have more than one, but nevertheless. So I teach a course here on nuclear weapons in South Asia, and that's what I do some research on as well. I was interested in what you were talking about, this project that you're involved in, or is it Scott Sagan about India? And I was just curious as to whether you had started that project and what sort of interesting initial findings or experiences you had seen so far.
Sure. The one I mentioned was done by Scott a couple of years ago, and they wrote a short article. It was one of the, I think, Indian newspapers. I'm sure you can find it. I mean, if you go it, which basically told briefly a story about them surveying in the population, about trying to find out. But what he told me, and I really hope I'm quoting him right, if not, I'm apologizing in advance, is that generally the data was not reliable enough to be published in an academic journal. So they did try it a couple of years ago, but the data they got from a company, basically they believe that they are not reliable. We would like to give it a shot ourselves, but we are still trying to find some way of data collection that would be somewhat reliable and that could tell us a little bit about general population, not just about some very specific samples. So we have it as an intention, but we still haven't decided what would be the best way how to collect the data, how to conduct this survey in a way that is representative. But we want to try it.
Yeah, go for one more.
So, I mean, actually, Abner just left, but you guys, if I followed the discussion correctly about audiences, and one of the criticisms of Sagan's work being that these are just people and they're not the decision makers, right? Mm-hmm. And so, I think one way of looking at it would be to see how decision makers, stakeholders, political actors can use or manipulate the priorities of audiences as a way of gaining more, legitimacy, more influence within the system. I wrote a paper, and I don't mean to turn this into a plug for that paper, but I wrote this paper on Pakistan last year, which looked at how you have some terrorist actors in Pakistan who seek to use nuclear weapons issues in a rhetorical manner to gain more political legitimacy in the system, whereby they're saying we are the true champions and not the military, not the civilian leadership or anyone else. And so that seemed to be an interesting way of trying to exploit the priorities of the audience, of the general population for their own political purposes. Yeah. And not really looking at nuclear weapons from an operational perspective, but more from a from a rhetorical perspective.
Yeah, sure.
In
my view, that's really what framing is about, and
right.
And there is a very frequent criticism, which I actually accept to be kind of fair. When we are presenting, discussing some framing, we often tend to, present it like, okay, this is, something that can be policy relevant and could be very useful. We are usually presenting as NGO issues because, I mean, we care about issues like disarmament and how to reach a bigger audience. But we have to admit that there's a dark side of this one. Framing can be also very much misused. And maybe some framing in the same way that can be used for or getting support for good policies. In our view, good policies can be very much misused or used by the other side by policies which we actually don't like, and they could be just reframe and get more support for policies which we wouldn't support. I mean, and you have billion of cases from our history. Many wars have been launched with a big public support, and the decision makers have been looking for framing in order to how to frame the reason for war, how to frame launching the war in a way that would reach a wide audience and get support even from people that probably were not supportive of them in general, but would be supportive of this one if you just give it a proper framing. So yes, framing can be very much misused on the other side as well.
And you've probably seen the book. This was maybe 10, 12 years ago, but there was this very interesting book edited by E.T. Abraham called South Asian Cultures of the Bomb. Mm-hmm. And that has a series of really interesting chapters about how nuclear weapons and the imagery has become part of popular imagination, and from multiple perspectives, not just political scientists or even academics. I thought that was a really instructive work, which showed, and it's fascinating that it happened after 98. I mean, before 98, nuclear weapons were not part of popular culture in South Asia. But over a two-decade period, how they've become part of popular culture, that was fascinating. So that's one element of the framing that takes place in the public space.
All right. Well, I think we've probably one more, James. We get the final question.
Just sort of two related questions, really. One, a lot of your work deals with sort of human psychology. You talk about in and out groups.
Sorry.
A lot of this deals with cognitive science, and obviously we're talking about a lot of your research and interviews are based in the US, where there's a big polarization between conservatives and liberals, which you mentioned. I just wondered if you had any kind of overarching insights or thoughts from a kind of human psychology point of view from your various interviews over the years. And secondly, you mentioned policy impact. I just wondered the extent and the kind of feedback and reactions you've had from, I guess, the policy community or the defense community in the US and beyond, to your research, and is it having any kind of traction or impact? Is that kind of hard to, is that kind of hard to gauge?
As for the first question, I mean, okay. Again, it's very hard for me to say definitely something like very general, since we all these studies were only relying on US sample. But if we would link what we found here with a lot of studies, about psychologists in different cultures around the world, with using not the same like empirical area, but using the same conceptual theoretical framing, also drawing on these moral foundations, which again were tested in basically all cultures that you can find today in the world. We can. My instinct would be that there would be genuine differences between people which are really caring more about really weighting and caring more differentiating between their own in group and the out group, and being very sensitive to something happening in their own surroundings against what's happening to people on the other side of the world, and people who are just more generally caring about suffering, and who are really counting these differences, and who are basically saying, okay, 10 dead people are more than 5 dead people. It doesn't really matter where, but it's just terrible. And I think these differences are there. There's still like a big. I think there can be a lot of like cultural differences of how this is influencing you and how much you are relying on your in group. But I think this is something that can be like universally found everywhere, and this is something where this general hawkishness towards the use of weapons against other countries would be coming from. But to say it a little more definitely, we definitely need to test it way beyond the United States and try it in Asian cultures and in European countries. Okay, at least in Europe, I think that so far what I saw, for example, from Scottsburg, a lot of findings seem to be consistent with what he did in the US. Of course, not the same numbers, but let's say the same consistency throughout the results. So we could we could probably go in this direction as well. But yeah, so this is something that I have an intuition that how it could work in other cultures, but hard to say before we get empirical data. And sorry, what was the second question?
To the policy impact, the reaction
The
from
policy
DC or from the defense community
Yeah,
within and outside the US.
I'm actually not sure. Maybe Jeff a little bit know about US debate, about how much actually because I'm quite aware about the splash that Scott's work actually did in the academic community, because I talked to a lot of people who either really like the research and were trying to follow in his footsteps, to people who are really very much averse to his findings, and I'm thinking specifically averse to findings, that they really don't like what he found, and trying to criticize it from very different angles. Some of them I found to be more legitimate, some of them not. There is I don't know if you guys read Charlie Carpenter's and Alex Montgomery's criticism of Scott, which has been quite fierce about but from different perspective. First of all, being problematic, in a way he's designing his research, but also about normative implication, what he's saying, or how it can influence the general US population, or even decision makers, who would be then believing that it could be more legitimate to use nuclear weapons. So there is a lot of so this is my take on the academic debate, or people who are also writing for policy-oriented journals, but they are from academic area. But I'm not sure if you Jeff maybe heard something, if from someone working for.
I don't have any sense that this particular line of research has had any policy impact. It's kind of a little sociology of the profession here. So the original article that Scott published with Dow Press and Ben Valentino was published in the American Political Science Review. Now, if you're an academic political scientist in the United States, that's the equivalent of Science or Nature. That's the most hard to get into, prestigious journal academically you can get into. Zero policymaker in Washington ever reads it. It's considered theoretical and mathematical and having no connection to the real world. Scott's things that he's published in international security or foreign affairs, or journals like that would be much more likely to get.
Which he actually did, right? He published in International Security the one about
the Iran,
where he basically was claiming, a lot of Americans are comfortable or are willing to kill 1 million Iranians.
Among people in our field, Scott probably has more impact than most of us, but I don't think that particular piece of work even made the slightest ripple in DC.
But I actually think that some of his findings he also published in some more general, as an op-ed, newspaper or something like that. So maybe
some of them were op-eds.
Yeah. So maybe it reached out to some people, but it's a bit hard to say. The criticism that it could influence some thinking of some people about what policies may be, suddenly legitimate. Yeah, it may be valid, but hard to say. I still haven't heard from any strictly policy-oriented people, if they read the research, if they are taking from it some findings, that will be shaping their thinking. But maybe it's just our.
I cherry pick the ones that suit their own policies.
Yes. That's very, very often the case.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're at about time. So for those who stayed for the whole thing, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.